This is going to be a very exciting hour and a half because we are extremely fortunate to have four of the most important agents of progressive change in Canada with us here this evening. I'm going to introduce the four of them briefly, and I could go on at great length about each one, but I won't. And then instead of letting them give opening statements as such, I'm going to ask each of them individually a question that will enable them to present an opening statement in the form of a response, because we want to transition to a dialogue among the five of us as quickly as possible. I want to get us in that question-response kind of swing. So, Alan Broadbent, the best description I've read of you, Alan, is that you're an activist businessman, or a businessman activist. And boy, is he ever. Alan Broadbent is chairman and CEO of the Havana Capital Corporation and founder and chairman of the Maytree Foundation, which focuses on poverty issues in Canada, with a special interest in refugees and immigrants. He is, and this is quite relevant here in Vancouver, the past chair of the Tides Canada Foundation. He's an advisor to the wonderful Literary Review of Canada. He's a senior fellow of Massey College. And he is, of course, a member of the Order of Canada. For the younger people in this room, Order of Canada was at one point, a few generations back, a replacement for British-style honours. So in a different period, we would have with us this evening Sir Alan. Or maybe that's Sir Alan the Dragon Slayer, given the important work that you do. Over here on my far right, on your far left, is Vanessa Timmer, who is the executive director of One Earth, which is a Vancouver-based, and I love this, think and do tank, focusing on sustainable consumption and production, where she works with my friend and hero, Bill Rees, the man who coined the term ecological footprint. Vanessa is also an associate with the Sustainability Science program at Harvard University, and she co-hosts a TV program, the Sustainable Region. And last but not least, Vanessa was a classmate of my wife's in the graduate program in environmental change and management at Oxford University. So we go way, way back. Someone I don't know as well, but I'm very pleased to have you this evening, is Ginger Gosnell-Meyers, who was of the Niska and Kwakiutl First Nations, who has worked on the Environics Urban Aboriginal Peoples Study as both project manager and public engagement director. The Urban Aboriginal Peoples Study is Canada's leading research on Aboriginal peoples' values, aspirations, experiences, and identity in urban settings. And of course, Canada's urban Aboriginal population is extremely large and often overlooked, so this is extraordinarily important. She's an Action Canada Fellow from 2004, a remarkable organization, former co-chair of the National Youth Council of the Assembly of First Nations, and an associate of the Centre for Dialogue with Simon Fraser University, our physical hosts this evening. Last but not least, Brigitte DePape. Brigitte is the lead organizer with an organization called SHD, which in polite company is Shit Harper Did. She was a co-organizer for Power Shift 2012, will be participating in Global Power Shift, and is on the steering committee for the upcoming Power Shift BC. She studied organizing with Marshall Gantz. He's the guy who made Barack Obama President of the United States, his lead organizer. And she came to all of our attention on June 3rd, 2011, when, as a Senate page, she stood in the middle of the Senate chamber during the throne speech holding up a red stop sign with the words "Stop Harper" painted on it. It's interesting. She was found in contempt of Parliament and fired from her job. And there was an incredible irony to this, because Stephen Harper had been found in contempt of Parliament a few months earlier and was allowed to keep his job. Okay, on to some opening questions. Alan, you wrote the book on cities. Are cities the central overriding locus of change in today's world? And if so, is that necessarily the case, and is it exclusively the case?
Well, it would be nice if that was true, that they were central to change and really powerful instruments for it. I would make an argument that cities are incredibly important when you're thinking about wanting to change things, that they bring together a number of things. They have critical mass, just because of the size of the population, that many people together, which creates markets for all sorts of things. It creates markets for commerce, obviously, but also for the arts, for social ideas, for innovation, and they create intellectual markets as well. They also are places, particularly in Canada, of diversity, and Vancouver is a tremendous example of that. And diversity in terms of where people come from, but also diversity of ideas, diversity of values and beliefs, and that's important. They have the benefit of proximity, people living together and being forced to kind of adapt and accommodate each other and learn how to work together and build off each other. And they're the places, I think, where we each create part of the platform that other people get to operate off. So I think they are incredibly important, but they do have some problems to overcome before they can really be powerful instruments for change. One of them is that they're kind of the constitutional orphan in Canada. They don't really have status, and they lack the powers that they need to really kind of maximize their ability to have a positive impact. And they're subject to wealth stripping by the federal and provincial governments through the taxation systems. They're underrepresented generally in the parliaments, as the distribution still favors rural areas in Canada. And they're also the subject of persistent kind of urban myths about pollution and crime and that sort of thing. So I would argue that they could be much more powerful if they had stronger revenue instruments that gave them the capacity to actually affect change. And I just used two things to illustrate that. One is public transit. The other is affordable housing and supportive housing for people who live with disabilities. And the cities experience the need for these things not just as kind of social goods, but as vital economic goods and really primary instruments of equality for people, equality of access to the benefits of society. But they don't have the revenue sources to be able to build these things. And so they need to go to the federal and provincial governments to get the money to build transit systems, get the money to build the housing that we need. And they can't do it because those levels of government don't allow cities to have access to sales tax or income tax, which are the two, if you know tax, they're the two biggest revenue instruments for governments. And cities are really reliant in Canada on property tax, which is it's still a good instrument, but it's limited, it's small. And so we need to be able to, I think, empower cities to be more effective instruments of change, and particularly around these big items like transit and housing, which are, that's how people get to work, that's how people get to school, that's allows them to live close to where they work and go to school or go to their place of worship or go to the playing field or the concert hall. And so I think cities are vitally important, but they're kind of, as I say, the orphans, and we need to do something about that.
And of course, we're in a very significant city this evening, a city that struggles with some major issues like poverty and homelessness and transit, but is also on the Pacific Rim, and the second largest port on the west coast of North America, with incredible connections to Asia reflected in very large diasporas here. And we'll come back to this evening about cities and geography and diasporas as all ingredients of change.
Right.
Vanessa, just a couple of months ago, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reached 400 parts per million. And as we know, the overwhelming majority of climate change scientists have warned that we can't go above 350 without catastrophic consequences. So in the world in which you live, environmental activism, policy-oriented change related to the environment, how are we actually doing if that number continues to grow? And more importantly, or just as importantly, can you see any positive change ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a really great point. You have this challenge, this number that's in front of us, and I'm not sure about many of you, but a lot of these kinds of, this issue of climate change, and in our case, some of the patterns of consumption and production that lead to those kinds of symptoms like climate change, that's the kind of change that I'm seeking to address in the world. It's this kind of large-scale systems change. And I actually really like the title of this panel, where does change happen? Mm-hmm. And you were just speaking to Alan about the geography issue here. And I think we're really talking about the geography of change. And so when you look at, like everyone who's here, you might be thinking, well, where do I put my efforts in terms of change? And I would say it really depends on the issue that you're trying to address. I mean, if you're wanting to address something that's very local, then placing your efforts there is really important. If you're looking at a broader issue, you might start to think about other geographies, other scales, from the local to the city to the North American to global. And that has different implications of how you do this. Just recently, so that larger scale change, which is needed for things like climate change, I would say requires a very different change strategy than if you're working at, for example, the local level. It's something that people have a sense of what to do. So if you have a sense of what to do, for example, in terms of bringing back biodiversity to a particular riverbed, and you know exactly what you can do. In fact, you can look around the world and say, this is what we need to do here. That's one type of change. There is now more and more of us around the world and trying to think about how do you tackle systemic change. So change which has different characteristics. And I'll give you an example. Last week I was at a conference where Adam Kahane, who's a change specialist, was speaking. And I really like this. He defined 3 different types of complexity of change. And I think it's really useful. The first one is that it's complex in the sense that the causes and effects, the ways things are interdependent, is separated in time and space, and there's a lot of elements to it. And so he would call that systems complexity, and climate change is a great example of that. The second type is about the number of people that have to be involved to solve it, and he calls that participatory complexity. So this gets at what Alan was just saying about how cities have a diversity of players. So when we're faced with complex challenges, we can actually bring a diversity of perspectives to bear. It's not top-down, it's participatory. And the third type, which I thought was really interesting, is where we don't know where we're going. So climate change is a great example of that, and I would say consumption and production systems transforming the way we move our stuff through our lives and our economy. That's also, we don't really know what that looks like on the other side. So we're taking steps forward around addressing 400 parts per million without a great sense of what that looks like when we get to the other end. And he calls that generative complexity. And actually, I think we're starting to learn, and I can speak more about this after we all connect, I think we're starting to learn about what works and how to work across scales when you've got that mix of systemic, participatory and generative complexity, when you've got a system that's messy, that needs lots of people to solve it, and where we don't know exactly where we're headed. And I've seen there's a lot of new ways to start trying to unpack how to move forward on that kind of change.
It's interesting because by accident of history and geography, this city is located at the end of a pipeline from Alberta that is proposed to carry very substantial amounts of bitumen to this coast and then onwards to Asia. So all of a sudden climate change and the national becomes very local. And it's significant that the mayors of both Vancouver and Burnaby have very strongly opposed the expansion of Kinder Morgan. So we could perhaps talk about that later in the conversation, because it does provide a connection point between the systemic and the local and the city and the Pacific. Ginger, I have to ask you about Idle No More, which was a remarkable movement, is a remarkable movement that captured national attention just in the last year. And it was a very exciting thing to witness. And yet at the same time it has faded from at least media attention and to some degree from the public conscience. So I have two related questions for you. Has Idle No More accomplished much of significance yet? And secondly, what's next?
I just want to say, first off, Vanessa, when you're talking about a complex, messy system, you don't know where it's going to go, and it takes so many people to try and figure out what's next, my first thought was, oh my God, that just sounds like the Indian Act. Because that's essentially what is the foundation of Idle No More. Idle No More was really born from, like this need to stand up and say, this country is going in a direction that we're not comfortable with, we're not happy with. And I mean, we have feet, we have, like public spaces, we have people who are really concerned about what might happen if we don't stand up and say stop. Thank you. And then it really migrated into First Nations and Aboriginal people looking inward at our own communities and acknowledging that we have all of these issues facing our people and our communities. And while it might not just focus on the Indian Act, it focuses on First Nations leadership, which so many of us, myself especially, am not happy with. I'm not happy with our Canadian representatives at the political system, really provincially or nationally. What can you do when you're a person who is just constantly being assaulted with things that will make a lot of people rich and will take away everything that you thought you could grow up with and pass on to your children, or really takes away your ability to have this type of society that you thought you could have? Idle No More is so many things. So when you ask, has it died? I know that's not what you asked, but I mean, a lot of people do bring up in conversations, like, has Idle No More died, because it's not in the public spotlight. But what was incredible about it is that it brought people together that wouldn't have normally come together, because we don't have spaces for Aboriginal people in this country to just talk about the issues, talk about the solutions, identify our aspirations, because we're not just a people who are burdened with problems. We're a people that have a great deal of education and knowledge that could really benefit all Canadians, that isn't being recognized by anybody, especially not our education system. And Idle No More has just left us with this gift. It's left us with this memory of what we can do when we come together A lot of us may have been strangers before, but, like Facebook will tell us to meet on Commercial and Broadway and bring your drums and, sing and dance about what it is that you want to stop, and sing and dance a little bit louder about what you want to see started. And for such a marginalized population to stand up and do this is incredible. So it hasn't stopped. We're just wondering what's next. And it's something that I've been waiting for a very long time. I'm very uncomfortable with where we're at right now with all of our decision makers. And so for me, Idle No More is especially about a change in leadership and shifting that power to the people and focusing it on a more local level, because that's where so much of our power has been stripped away. And it's a shame, because Canada's supposed to be this great country, and we're just diminishing. We're allowing our power and our creativity to be diminished. And we're so comfortable with it. And it's making some of us sick, and it's making some of us stand up and dance and say stop.
Mm-hmm. I should say that one of my great-grandmothers was First Nations, and there are millions of Canadians who do not self-identify who share the pain and concern because of an ancestral connection, and millions more who share the concern simply because they're good people. You're not alone. Brigitte, civil disobedience. When you
Go.
when you stood in the Senate, it was immediately after a federal election that gave the Conservatives a majority government. I personally think it was an incredibly important thing, not just because of the statement, but because progressive forces in this country had been knocked flat by that election outcome. I know hundreds of activists who were despondent, who were on the verge of simply giving up, that it was all over. And then a young woman stood up and told them that the fight had to continue. And one saw immediately after your direct action a resurgence of progressive activism in this country. You relit the flame. It was an incredibly important moment. But the connection to electoral politics was not obvious, in the sense that you were not trying to necessarily influence the next election 4 or 5 years hence. You were, in a sense, protesting about what had just happened and what Harper might do with his new powers. Now you're working for SHD, which had its conception as a tool of influencing an election. And those incredibly powerful YouTube videos that had young people talking about the shit that Harper had done. And it went viral. It was powerful. But it was election-oriented. So is there a connection between stage 1 of your public activism, civil disobedience, and stage 2, working for an organization that's trying to influence elections? In short, is civil disobedience part of politics, or is it seeking to overthrow politics and start again?
I'd like to sort of answer through a story.
Please.
And when I was working in the Parliament, and I was, pouring water to Prime Minister Stephen Harper and to his friends, I felt really afraid about the direction we're headed in, about the attacks on people of color, on Indigenous people, on workers, on women, on migrants, on youth, on people who are being impacted by climate change, who are being displaced, victims of Harper's foreign wars. And I'd invite everyone to reflect on how how you feel in terms of your ability to affect change. And I just felt so utterly powerless in this role of obeying the prime minister that was only elected with 39% of the popular vote, going against the will of our people. So I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. And luckily, I had some friends who were trained in direct action. And so they knew what to do. And they knew that we should go and see a lawyer and ask, what will be the possible consequences of doing this kind of action? And our lawyer said, the worst case scenario will be 30 years in jail for frightening the Queen. So on June 3rd, it's the speech from the throne. I'm there, and I am so terrified. I see all of the politicians. I see Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the Governor General. I'm afraid. I'm afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid of what my dad is going to say. I'm afraid of frightening the Queen. But I really feel the incredible strength of people who are directly impacted by Harper's agenda, by residential school survivors, by women who are surrounded by tar sands development and who are afraid for their children, their future, drinking the water. The incredible strength of Indigenous women, of people who are threatened by debt, have these incredible burdens of debt, but yet continue to struggle through it. So feeling that strength and that responsibility to one another. And so that's when I decided to hold up the Stop Harper sign. And it felt so liberating. And to be able to say to others, you are not alone. We're in this together. And since then, I was so excited to meet the group Shit Harper Did, which is working to mobilize young people. And I really see it as a possible way of realizing that dream of stopping Harper together. When we look at the election of progressive governments, like Obama's election, we see that the conditions that created him being elected, one important condition that was part of that was the wave of youth activism and young people taking direct action in the lead up to his election. So there were young people who were occupying homes against foreclosures. There were young people, migrant youth, who were fighting for the DREAM Act, for migrant reform, who were risking arrest. And they were raising the stakes. They were pushing the urgency of the issue. They were shifting the Overton window of what is politically possible. You had young people risking arrest during the Keystone protests at the White House. Hundreds of people who risked arrest, young people. And it was under these conditions in which Obama was elected. So I do believe that this shows us the critical importance of civil disobedience, not only for cultural change, which I think is so incredibly important, and like we have seen with Idle No More, with the round dances, the impact that has had culturally is so significant. Seeing people like my grandpa coming to round dances and holding signs that say, I support Indigenous rights, that cultural impact is incredible. Then also to see how civil disobedience has a real impact electorally. And we saw the same thing with the civil rights movement when JFK was elected. That was under the conditions of young people taking direct actions, like the lunch counter sit-ins, like the bus boycotts. It was under those conditions that JFK was elected. So I do see a really important link between those two.
Okay. Well, thank you. So we have 4 starting positions, as it were. And there are a whole bunch of different questions that we could turn to next, and I want to see if we can get some connectivity going. So I'm going to start with Brigitte first. You, through direct action, are challenging the status quo. You're challenging power established institutions. Does that mean you reject established institutions and rules outright, or is this simply a way of creating leverage points for changing institutions in more conventional ways?
I think that the established rules, or lack thereof, have been largely created by those with power in order to maintain their power. So an example of this would be, I'll explain this through a story. There's this amazing grandmother from Guatemala who saw her community being transformed into a mining community. And I raise this because I know that we are in Goldcorp, and I think it's really a Goldcorp-sponsored building, so I think this is really important to bring up. And she saw this mining company come into her village and begin mining operations, gold mining operations there. And she saw the pollution that it was causing for her and her family, and people being poisoned. And the whole community, 99% of this community in Guatemala, rejected this mine. And yet it went ahead, precisely because of the lack of rules for corporations like these who are operating in these communities. And so we see this incredible imbalance in terms of who is controlling the rules or lack thereof. So this woman and other grandmothers, when they saw that their grandchildren were being poisoned, what they did was they decided to break the rules, and they cut the wire to the power of the mine. And so that was an act of civil disobedience. And that was breaking the rules. And so that's just one example of when those rules are unequal, how people, in order to survive, feel the need to do direct action. And so another example is with the tar sands and the complete lack of regulation. And given that RBC is a sponsor, I do think it's important to name that RBC is sponsoring the tar sands. They're one of the largest financial institutions that are giving loans to the tar sands. And, I went to Fort McMurray, and that's why I really feel it really close, is that I met this woman, Selena, and she told me she was worried about her daughter drinking the water because she lives in Fort McKay, where it's surrounded by tar sands development. And she feared her daughter's life. She can only take 2-minute baths because, the water is contaminated. And they never agreed to that. There are no rules for these institutions. And so she said, she called on me and she said, come and bring your people. We need to do civil disobedience here. And at that time, I was really moved by that call, but I didn't know who my people were, and I didn't know how to bring them there. But that is a very real call that is being made by some people there. And so I do feel a sense of responsibility in some ways, and I do think that in those instances, sometimes we do need to break the rules.
It's interesting. My wife and I switched our mortgage from RBC to our local co-op because of the tar sands. See?
That's awesome.
We didn't break any rules doing that. And I'm not sure that RBC noticed. And that will perhaps come up in a latter part of the discussion. Ginger, a lot of frustration at different levels of government, including Indigenous government. A lot of frustration at the Indian Act. How do you feel about existing rules and institutions? Do you think that First Nations and other people should be working within institutions, working to change through elections, or at what point does a rejection of the rules become necessary or legitimate? There are First Nations peoples in this country who have resorted to blockades in the past and will likely do so in the future. Where do you see that line between the legal, in quotation marks, and the illegal?
Mm-hmm. It's so hard to say that just because it's illegal to do something that it shouldn't be done. I think that we're really faced with those conditions right now. Here in BC, when we talk about the pipeline, I think people's second thought is somebody going to bomb it? Because you just have so many hard feelings around what the potential damage for that could be. I look at the rules that we have right now for Aboriginal people, and I just think it's all so broken. It was started so long ago, and it just didn't stop, and it's continuing today. You see, this legislation that just passed to provide women on reserves with rights to 50% of the property if they get divorced, because that, just a few weeks ago wasn't possible. The man could walk away with everything. And that isn't enough either. We just need options. We don't have the right people making the options. I think we're really comfortable as a society right now. I think if you want to gather together to talk about what you need to do next, you need to pay, or you need to go to university where you have to pay a heck of a lot more than our parents did. And it just seems very unfair at the moment. I, for one, love being in Vancouver. I think it's a great place to be. I find a lot of like-minded people here. Idle No More was largely an urban experience. But, you see a lot of people in the smaller communities now, speaking up against, their elected chief and council, and speaking up against the processes that they have to live with. And my personal experience, being Nisga'a, we have a modern-day treaty, and for the most part, British Columbians are being sold on this idea that modern-day treaties is going to solve everything. First Nations leaders are saying treaties are going to increase our quality of education or quality of life. You won't hear about housing anymore. You're going to hear about self-determination and self-governance. And we've lived with the Nisga'a Treaty for 13 years, and there's no monitoring. The rules were created by people who, nobody asked me, nobody asked Nisga'a people how they wanted their governance to be. We had this perfect opportunity to create a system of governance, to create our own rules, to create bounds for, what can happen or not happen in our society. And that didn't happen because we have so many other rules. And people and ideas invested in what they want to continue to take from our land. It's just such a mess.
Yeah, one of the ironies is that in terms of bitumen pipelines and First Nations, you and other First Nations peoples have extraordinary power because of Section 35 of the Constitution Act, mm-hmm. and the duty to consult.
Yeah.
And the fact that there is a relative lack of treaties here in BC, which gives that duty to consult additional scope and leverage. Mm-hmm. So ironically, having been excluded, mistreated, neglected by rules and institutions in the next 10 to 15 years, you may find a great deal of your political power coming from one. We might come back to that later. The other thing I just want to say is that there's a difference between civil disobedience and violence. So I don't actually imagine that Brigitte will be blowing up any pipelines, but I'm absolutely certain that she will be swimming under the Lionsgate Bridge in front of a tanker. Two quite different things, both obviously seeking to stop a pipeline, but one which is morally quite distinct from the act of violence. Alan, you've had an extraordinary career as an activist, working to some degree within the system, working within the business community, founding innumerable institutions, chairing the Tides Foundation. The list goes on and on. You're obviously someone who believes that change can happen working within the rules or using institutions to change rules through democratic process. So how do you feel when you sit beside someone like Brigitte DePape, who takes a different view? And I love having the two of you see it side by side, because you do reflect the epitome of two different forms of activism.
It is very much, though, part of a continuum. Mm-hmm. I think what you're doing and the Idle No More and numerous other instances where citizens stand up and say what they think should be happening and protest things. I think that's very important, and it's very often the only way that you can begin to get enough attention onto an issue or a problem to be able to do anything about it. I also think it's important to think about where you take that, and then how the change is going to occur that you're going to seek. We've been in Canada in the last 30, 40 years, been incredibly interested and focused on identity and rights, and I would say that has kind of driven much of the way society has evolved over that period of time. And one of the things that I think we haven't been as good at is paying attention to our institutions and paying attention to the instruments that we create to create the change we want. And so, when you stand up in Parliament and protest in that way, you're really pointing out that we failed to maintain our institutions of democracy in the way we should have been maintaining them. We've allowed the Prime Minister's office to essentially become a dictatorship, and the democracy in our Parliament has really been devalued to an incredible extent, so that when you have legitimate interests like changing the Indian Act or eliminating the Indian Act or environmental legislation or whatever it is, it's really hard to get through because the funnel for everything has become so narrow. If you can't fit it through that funnel, you're kind of lost. I just finished on the weekend Vincent Lam's wonderful biography of Tommy Douglas in the Extraordinary Canadian series, and one of the reason Vincent Lam, who's a wonderful writer and also a medical doctor, was chosen to write that was because of the importance of the development of Medicare. And this came out of a number of people in Saskatchewan, but primarily Tommy Douglas, who understood from personal experience, but also from his kind of analysis that we needed a social medical care system, and he had to get enough public support and public expression for that to get the interest to go ahead and do it. But then the important thing was they had to design an instrument. What was the instrument? What was that? What was Medicare going to look like? And how was it going to function? And I think we pay a lot less attention to that these days in the kind of large public sphere than we should. But I also think those of us involved in trying to create change sometimes don't spend enough time paying attention to those instruments as well. We've tried this we do a lot of work at the Métis Foundation on immigration, and one of the areas we chose to focus on was when skilled immigrants come to Canada, can they use their experience, their work experience, and find the jobs for which they're trained and where they have experience. So can a doctor practice as a doctor? Can a pharmacist practice as a pharmacist? The answer generally is no, without a great amount of retraining. So what we've done is tried to create a number of instruments that can help change that situation. And one of them is a set of instruments that corporations can pick up in their human resource policy to become much less racist in the way they hire, much better at integrating the skills of foreign-trained professionals in their workplace. And I think we've been able to make some progress, not as much as we'd like, because we've focused on the instruments. So I think they're incredibly important to pay attention to institutions and instruments and to worry about whether they meet our aspirations and take us where we want to go. Because if we fail to do that, they'll atrophy, as I think our parliaments have done, and they won't take us where we want to go. And we'll need to keep Brigitte on the job.
Now, Vanessa, in terms of institutions, they're governmental institutions, they're non-governmental institutions. And in a democracy, the ideal is that they all function together in a sort of healthy mix of debate, cooperation, peaceful antagonism. But in terms of the environmental movement in Canada last year, something quite profound and disturbing happened. And the federal government came out in a verbally antagonistic way against environmental organizations like the Tides Foundation, labeling them radicals, and essentially directing the Canadian Revenue Agency to pay much closer attention to them. I wonder whether you wanted to comment on that, either that specific example or where the environmental movement generally sits in respect of the kinds of issues we're talking about, the institutional working within the system versus challenging the system, whether there's so much disquiet and discouragement arising from the system that there's a field for an entirely new construction of how we govern ourselves. Essentially, I guess the question is, are you an establishment or a radical environmentalist, and where do you think the rest of us should be?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I would say I'm both. And I think many of us are. So I loved how you're moving your hands when you were saying this, because I think what you were describing about this concerning issue of a pushing away of voice of concern and objection by the federal government is an example of the kind of dance of change. The fact that, Alan, you were saying before that being outside the system or inside the system is kind of a continuum. I see it more actually as this interactive or interplaying dance, because every rule and instrument, as you said with Tommy Douglas, at one point in time might have been someone's dream, someone's civil disobedience, where they started thinking, let's move this into a new space. And then what happens is that rule or institution might have served really well in a certain time, but over time, perhaps it's forgotten its origins, or maybe it starts to become too focused on maintaining the existing system when it's not actually addressing marginalized people or some of the voices of those who are getting hurt. So civil disobedience then plays a really critical role of actually saying, wait a minute, I think we set up these rules for a reason, and they're not actually, they're mismatched to what we want in the system. So I see it as a dance. This is, working in consumption and production systems, there's activists across the spectrum that we work with. And when I first started doing my research at the university, I was focused on the role of civil society groups or nonprofits in playing the Luke Skywalkers of this system. So basically, I saw them as these Jedi Knights, that there was this big Death Star of the rules and institutions, and the civil society groups, this is what I thought, the civil society groups would go in and just blast away those rules. And it was kind of this very linear idea that, at the end of the movie, the credits would roll and the Death Star had blown up. And I started to actually spend time with people who were inside these institutions and realized, first of all, that lots of people within the nonprofit sector have many different things pulling on them, and sometimes they get quite fixed on things. And also, I found people within government and business and the financial sector, in schools, in hospitals, that were change agents within the institution. And later I found out some people call those people institutional entrepreneurs. You have the social entrepreneurs who are disrupting the system, either from creating these civil disobedience or these experiments that flower up from trying things out in a new way, or people who are social entrepreneurs by telling whole new stories of who we could be at the cultural level. I think we often overlook these institutional entrepreneurs who are inside the system and perhaps are unhappy with the way the rules are set up. So some of the Canadian government people we work with on consumption and production are calling us up. I think there's an opportunity here. This instrument could be used for larger change. Oh, wait, I think if we move the rules this way, perhaps we can shift the system in that way. And so I think that's a critical thing. Let's nurture the institutional entrepreneurs, sometimes protect them because they're being super brave within an existing system. And their role is also to receive some of those innovations happening at a much more disruptive space. So I think that's a really important role. I want to say one more thing about this dance of change. I think we often forget that when we're going from civil disobedience, these new rules that we want, from scaling those out across lots of communities who are standing up saying no more, no more, and suddenly the day comes where somebody says, okay, now what? What do we want to do now that we have this disruption happening? Scaling out is very different and needs different skills from scaling up. And I know Alad Mansky's here from Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network. He was working on scaling out support groups for disabled people so that they would have support groups of family and friends around them over their lifetime, and they wouldn't just be dependent on their family but had a larger support group. And as he was scaling it out across the country, they had this moment where they realized what they needed to do was scale up. And Al actually worked with the government in creating a registered disability savings plan where these marginalized communities suddenly had an institutional or set of rules and instrument for being able to support themselves over the long term, even when their parents had passed away, for example. And that took a very different skill set to understand what was happening with the government than it did if you're just replicating from community to community. So I think as we think about becoming from civil disobedience to telling the rules of the game, we also have to think about what kinds of things do we need to train ourselves in terms of dealing with power structures and having that kind of sensitivity, Alan, that you have about how the institution is structured and how we can use those instruments and the new rules for change.
It's interesting in the point about the I forget what you call them, the entrepreneurs.
Institutional, the intrapreneurs,
yeah.
Exactly.
And actually, Al, in the example of getting the RDSP, discovered this, that very often you'll find people in there, working within government, working within an institution, who are just waiting in effect for permission to participate, and they have deep knowledge. They've been working on these things for years and years, and then when enough voices start creating attention on things, and the finance ministry or whatever it is says, what do we do about this? There's somebody who says, well, actually, I have an idea. I've been working on this, and we have something. I think that's really an important discovery for us, people seeking change, that there are people who can be hugely helpful. They have deep knowledge, they have long experience, and they're just waiting for the opportunity to play a role.
Now, in the 10 or 15 minutes we have left, we have to talk about one particular space in which change occurs or could occur, and that is the internet. You've been trained by Marshall Gantz, who used the internet very effectively in 2008. And yet at the same time, we all know that pressing like on Facebook is not the same as voting in an election or standing in the streets. And we also know that powerful agents can use the internet to track activism and to shut it down. We found out just in the last week that the NSA in the United States and the CSA here in Canada have got extensive internet surveillance programs. And we found out yesterday that the British government was actually reading the BlackBerry messages of governmental delegations to the G20. So if they can read Stephen Harper's BlackBerry, they can definitely read your emails, Brigitte. So here's the question. Not just is the internet important to activism, because panels have talked about this before, but what happens to political activism if we lose the internet, or if we can't use the internet because it's no longer a private space? Brigitte, why don't you start?
Yeah, it's been amazing to see the role that the internet has played in revolutions, like during the Arab Spring, to see that it's been playing in social media with the uprisings in Turkey, to see the role that it's played, with the Obama campaign. And there is one really unique opportunity that I want to share with you all today. With Shit Harper Did, we are working to stop the Conservatives from their ad spending on the Economic Action Plan ads. I don't know if you've seen those. So if you have your cell phone with you, I would ask that you would text JOB to the following number. It's 1-604-229-3344. And this is to sign a petition, online petition, to stop the Conservatives from their ad spending and instead give the job to Shit Harper Did to produce those ads. So yeah, I would encourage you to do that, but very much in line with this online activism, that's really what we're doing. I really see the internet as this really powerful tool to connect us, and to connect us in a way that is quite horizontal. And I think that if the internet, say, were to disappear, if they disconnected all of us, that would bring us face to face. I think that, and there's a lot of power in that as well. And I think that it would force us to create change in a different way. That would bring us out of our homes and more face to face into the streets. I think while we have the internet, we can use it and we can really make the most of it and do a mix of that online and offline engagement. But certainly if they cut off the internet, that won't stop us, and I think it actually could just reconnect us more face to face.
Ginger, you talked about the importance of the internet in Idle No More. And it strikes me that the internet is particularly important for small communities separated by significant geographic space. Canada's First Nations, on reserve, in cities, from coast to coast, and if you include the Inuit, to coast. So the internet is particularly important, isn't it, for First Nations activism? So what would happen to Idle No More if that vehicle were taken away?
Well, I think we'd have to rely on the memory of Idle No More and hopefully meet up with people that you met at one of the round dances. I mean, I completely agree with you, Brigitte. I think we need to, and Alan, you were talking about some of the instruments that we need for change. And we really need to focus on social engagement because that's what is missing in First Nations communities, like the opportunity for people to come together and discuss the ideas and debate them. And it could be over food, it could be over beer, it could be over, like an event. We've just lost that skill. And we've focused our energy instead on the internet. So Like I almost wish that the internet would go away just for a little bit so that we can figure out how to be people and society again. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So what we have to do is focus our efforts on building up those institutions that bring us together more so that we can talk and meet in person, because that's where the real change is going to happen over the long term, because it's so easy to just press like. But what you need is that volunteer that will stick it out for the long term, and maybe, you'll find a leader in this group that you can hold up and help to become elected, because that's what we're missing too, are people that reflect us and that we want to see represent us. And, these are the things that are going to create that long-term change, internet or no internet.
It's interesting, in the last month, one of the things I've done was a bit of a post-mortem on the recent NDP election campaign in BC. I use the word post-mortem intentionally. But one of the things that I learned in that exercise was that the local riding campaigns that sort of bucked the trend and elected NDP candidates in what had previously been Liberal ridings. So think of Vancouver Fairview, Vancouver Point Grey, Saanich North and the Islands, actually did something radically old-fashioned. They put a disproportionate amount of their resources into knocking on doors. Right? They realized that phoning wasn't working. People don't answer their phones. People don't have phones or landlines. It just wasn't working. They realized that Facebook and Twitter wasn't actually going to deliver people to the polls. So they just went out and did it the old-fashioned way. And the ones that were most effective weren't just, who are you going to vote for? It's, have you heard about this exciting new policy? It was actually engaging people rather than seeking to get them to commit so that you could simply mark down their preference so you could phone them on election day. So it's like going back. And I think this might speak to the internet as well, that we may have lost our balance because of our enthusiasm for this new technology. And we have to relearn how to connect as human beings in more direct ways. I don't know if you want to speak about this question, but I have another question for you.
Well, the only thing two things I'd say about that is that sometimes technology, and I don't know much about the internet, but it can actually make you think things are easier than they are, and so you don't work as hard. And when you have to go door to door, and what's the old political wisdom that to get a voter you need to have 12 points of contact with them during an election campaign, and if you don't get up to that 12, you're probably not going to get that vote. And that's all through hard work. It's door to door. It's dropping pamphlets. It's all the different points of contact, and you've got to make sure you do that. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say is that if I actually thought anybody was interested in what I was saying on my BlackBerry or my email, I'd revert to what they did in the Second World War when they thought that the information was being intercepted, and resort to misinformation. And so if somebody's really listening, I'm going to think what they shouldn't think I'm thinking.
Yes. One of my colleagues at UBC has a sign on his door, and it says, "We have no money, therefore we must think." And that's an important axiom for progressive activists, right? Because we have relatively no money, so we need to be smarter.
Innovate.
And innovate. Vanessa, the environmental movement, the internet, communication. In a sense, the environmental organizations have pioneered so much in terms of campaign techniques over the years. From Greenpeace and direct action to the incredible voter engagement that we've seen in some recent elections by Forest Ethics and others. The internet, an important venue. Can environmentalism transcend the internet? in the 21st century, or is it a necessary, inherent part of what you do?
Well, I mean, there are so many ways. I think the connecting thing is a key part of the role that the internet has played in expanding the environmental movement. But I think there's others. You know, we know a lot more about all aspects of the Earth and beyond because of the fact that we have that deep connectivity. We can now go to the bottom of the ocean in Google Ocean. We can find out what it feels for Chris Hatfield to be going over the Earth and looking back on the Earth. We have people who have mobile phones in the most remote places who can report, you know, fisheries damages or what have you. So we have a much better connectivity and a sense of the whole. So I think that's been a powerful aspect in terms of just creating a sense of the system, and also to start creating those kinds of feedback loops that we need to get to know what we need to do next. And I think the other piece is also you see the massive explosion of particular initiatives. So you have the transition towns ideas showing up in the UK, and within a few years you have hundreds of them showing up all around the globe. And, you know, they produce one guideline kit. They don't tell people how to do it, but they say, well, these are some ideas, and boom, it takes off in other places. So absolutely there are also examples in which the negative things are spreading fast, but I think some of these positive things spread in a quick way as well. It also enables things that were impossible years ago. I'll give you the example of collaborative consumption. So being able to have to share, for example, vehicles, or book a place on Airbnb, or to trade particular and barter particular goods, that entire collaborative economy or sharing economy for businesses and for households has been made possible because of the kind of open source technologies. And I would say it's also opening up, it has the potential to open up democratic institutions in terms of their transparency. So these are the types of ways that I think the internet has been a huge advantage in terms of moving us forward. However, I agree with everybody's comments that the heart of the movement lies in our connecting with each other, connecting with ourselves and natural systems and nature, and doing that, you know, face to face, in person. I think that's how we get the tribe together, and that's where the trust gets built. You can't be brave unless you're, you know, standing there in a way you had all those people beside you that you felt were vulnerable in that moment. And that bravery requires that you feel that kind of camaraderie, that kind of feeling of I'm with everyone on this. And that, I think, really gets built from the face-to-face time. I think it's a great enabler, and I don't think it's the only tool. I think there's a lot of ways we need to move forward on it, but I think I really think it has been an enhancing tool for getting a sense of the globe, for working together effectively, for learning together, and for allowing new forms of economic exchange that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Oh, by the way, and it forces us to tell really clear, good stories, because there's so much on the internet now that you have to get really smart. If you're gonna beat Grumpy Cat, you need to know what is your message, and to get really good at storytelling. So I find that people are getting way better at telling their story and drawing people in to invite them into the issue that they care about.
We're just about out of time, and I'm going to close this by asking one last question, and each of the panelists gets no more than 30 seconds to answer it. But it has to do with the fact that geography matters, and it matters that we're sitting here in Vancouver. In fact, it matters that we're sitting in this particular place in Vancouver. It matters that we're on the edge of the Pacific, that we're on the edge of an Asian growth that is truly staggering and is changing our world. It matters that we're on the edge of an ocean with all the environmentalism that comes with that. And we have three people here who've chosen to live in Vancouver, and one outsider who undoubtedly has...
Who grew up in Vancouver.
Who grew up in Vancouver. And so here's the question. What is most exciting to you about Vancouver's potential to be an agent of change? Brigitte, you moved here fairly recently, and you don't move by accident. You came here for a reason, so why?
So that grandmother who was in Guatemala, recently people have mobilized and changed the policy at the Royal Bank to respect Indigenous rights, and that was because of their mobilizing. And there's more further to go. I was really inspired to see Van City divest from the tar sands, and that to me is part of what is amazing about Vancouver, is this awareness around the environmental movement and what is happening here. I was really inspired to see the mobilizations against the pipeline, against the Enbridge pipeline. And I really see there's like this revolutionary spirit here that could really forge this power shift. I mean, seeing the Enbridge pipeline rejected, I know it's just one small step and it hasn't actually happened yet, but that is huge in terms of just that one first step in shifting the power. And I think that it's really, it can have a real profound impact on creating the just transition that we're all trying to create.
Okay. Ginger, Vancouver.
I agree. There's a lot of activists here, and I'm not sure if it's common elsewhere in the country, but you'll get together with friends here and you'll talk about, I don't know, the pipeline, or for me and my friends, we actually get together and talk about the Indian Act like all the time. You'll talk about, I don't know, something that you've seen on CBC, the National, or that you heard on the radio. We just get together and talk about the issues. And then we get together and we protest it. And it just seems like such a natural way to be. And if you haven't been to a protest in Vancouver, you're not a Vancouverite yet.
Good protests. Vanessa, Vancouver.
Well,
why have you stayed?
Why have I stayed here? Well, I mean, first of all, when I was very little, my dad and mom would take me on protest marches as part of growing up here. So I agree with that. I find that when I go global to talk with people about systemic change around environmental issues or around what we want to move forward in terms of all sorts of different issues, I find that the conversations that are happening at that global space are also happening in Vancouver. One of the things I think that we're learning about how large-scale systems change happens is we need some safe places to try out new things and to jiggle with the new world as it's coming into being. And I think Vancouver, my experience of Vancouver is that it is almost like, a fern is like a fractal of the larger system. I feel like Vancouver is like a fractal of the conversations and actions happening at the global scale. And we have the kind of diversity of people and thinking and strategies and ways of being here that allow us to try out the new and do it in a place where there is a possibility for seeing how it plays out. So that's my reason for staying in Vancouver. I feel like it's this fertile place to really dream the new and engage with the old in the same time. That's what I find exciting about it.
It's like an experimental garden.
It's an experimental garden. Yeah.
Alan, from your slightly outside perspective, what's the most exciting thing about Vancouver from the perspective of potential change?
Well, I think what's interesting about Vancouver is that probably more than any other place I've been, the spectacular geography gives people a sense of place, and that sense of place makes them care in the first place about the environment, about the water and the environmental issues, but it also then, how do we live together? How do we arrange ourselves so that we can, have a successful society, a successful city, and you get people engaged in those kinds of discussions. But I think a lot of it does grow out of that sense of uniqueness and sense of place, and that it's our place, and we need to care about the place. And I'm not. There's a lot of other places that don't have that. They have something else. And it can feed their civil society in an important way as well. But I think in Vancouver's case that's what I would say. And also, because uniquely in Canada, you can actually go to protests year round.
Wow. Now, I understand that there is a reception immediately following this event. And that reception is your opportunity to engage with these 4 incredible people. So please stay for the reception, and please join me in thanking the 4 of them right now.